It's that time of the year, and we're recording this on January 3rd, 2023, when we look towards the future to see what kind of energy stories and environmental stories we're likely to be covering this year. And so I'm going to be joined by Tim Gray, who's the Executive Director of Environmental Defence Canada, to talk about 12 predictions that he's made. So welcome to the interview, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's almost like it's a tradition in the media, right? When coming up to January 1, you look back on the year that's passed, what were the notable stories? And then early in 2023, you look forward to what's coming. And given where we're at in the energy transition and the evolution of policy at both the provincial and federal level, there's a lot to talk about. And you've narrowed it down to 12. And I want to go through each one of the 12. So let's start with number one. Canada will drive towards an equitable EV future. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, EVs are really ready for prime time now. I mean, I think a lot of the issues that people have had concerns about in terms of reliability, range, all those things have kind of been brushed aside. More and more people are trying them. And then once they have one, they're like, oh, I don't want to own anything else. So, but the problem that we're all facing, or many of us, I guess if you live in BC or Quebec, this isn't the case, but for the rest of us, try and get one. The waiting lists are years long in some cases. I just got a couple of emails from folks recently saying that their order had been so backlogged that finally the dealer just canceled it, saying there was no chance they were ever going to get one in the foreseeable future. So, we got to address this because, a key aspect of the energy transition in Canada and around the world is access to electric transportation. And unfortunately, public transit being the way that it is in most of the country, a lot of people are stuck in cars. So they need electric vehicles. So I think what you're going to see is the implementation of the Clean Car Standard by the federal government. Finally, it's been a long time coming. And that means that the car companies will either have to sell electric vehicles to the consumers who want them, or they'll have to pay a significant fine for not doing so. And that's really, really key now because as you probably are aware, and maybe a lot of other people probably wouldn't be, but a lot of the manufacturers are producing electric vehicles only in the numbers to give them kind of the halo effect. They're really, really trying to drive consumers mainly to buy large trucks and sport utility vehicles because that's where the big profits are. And we really need them to switch gears and gear up their manufacturing of electric vehicles in quantity, both across models, but also in numbers.
Now, that supply of electric vehicles, as you mentioned, is a problem, but it doesn't look like we're going to make much progress over the next, 2-3 years. I mean, I just did an interview with an engineer who had done the emissions numbers around transportation, and the biggest impediment to achieving Canada's emissions numbers are supply of electric vehicles. I mean, it's not just the plants. I mean, you have to build plants or convert plants. We don't have enough of those yet, and those don't appear overnight. They take at least several years to build. And then on top of that, we have a supply chain issue. So around electric vehicles, we can look at batteries, and we have critical minerals in Canada, but we don't have the processing and refining to turn those minerals into battery metals. 80% of that is in China. So if you mine some lithium here in Canada, you almost have to send it to China and then bring it back to build batteries. So what I know the government is putting pressure on the manufacturers, but in your opinion, can they scale up their manufacturing, scale up their supply chains in time to meet the zero emission vehicle mandate that the government is putting in place?
Yeah, I think they can. I mean, for two reasons. One is that some of the supply chain issues, especially around chips, which of course impact internal combustion engine vehicle manufacturing and electric cars as well, because they're both largely driven by computers. Those have been clearing up. In fact, there's chip surpluses in a bunch of markets now. But more broadly, in terms of converting ICE manufacturing into EVs, yes, that will take time. But part of this is just being competitive. A lot of US states, of course, do not have electric vehicle standards. A bunch do, California, and I think 14 other states. So I think what this will do for Canadians and our emissions here, but also cost of living and long-term expenses related to owning a car, is make more of those cars come to Canadian provinces that don't have mandates right now. Because there's no downside for, say, GM or Ford to make those electric vehicles that they are producing available in Ontario, rather than some US state where there's no mandate to do so, and therefore no penalty for not doing so. So I think you'll see a shift in the market. And with more demand and more consumers being confident they'll get their electric vehicles, I think that you'll continue to see more investment by some of the big auto manufacturers. Some will drag their heels for sure, but I think you can expect some of those to go the way of the dodo over the long term because of resistance to electrification.
Well, let's talk about your second prediction, which is that financial institutions will be forced to better align finance with climate action. We've seen a lot of criticism in the last few years of Canadian banks, which talk a good game, but in fact are still investing heavily in oil and gas infrastructure and operations, even some in coal outside of Canada. What is going to make those banks change their policies and change their practices?
Regulation. It's market failure right now. We need money to be going into the energy transition, and unfortunately, too much of it is still going into the fossil fuel economy. The first part of that is transparency around risk. There really needs to be better disclosure around what our banks and other federally regulated financial institutions are doing around long-term risk and where their money is going. And then stage two is to actually get them to a point where they're addressing that risk in a meaningful way, so that they have action plans to move their money away from things that are causing climate change to those that are helping to solve it. But it is going to take regulation, and the conversation is just getting underway. There's a really interesting bill that went through the Senate that was around climate disclosure that I think was quite well written, and the exercise in that. Going through that, having the conversations, having the hearings, I think was very valuable. There's going to be increasing pressure for the House to pick up that bill or a bill like it, and for the government to prioritize this going forward so that we can see the kind of financial transition that we're seeing in other sectors.
Are we seeing any pressure from shareholders, particularly maybe the activist shareholders, as well as environmental groups like yours, and even consumers, to pressure Canadian banks to change their practices here? I mean, they do talk a good game. You hear them all the time talking about climate change and a green future and all of that. But money talks, and so what?
It does, yeah. I mean, there is a real talking out both sides of your mouth kind of thing going on with Canadian financial institutions. Some of our banks are the most heavily invested in fossil fuels, and they're big players even on a global scale. So they're always looking to game any of the commitments that are made around net zero to put that transition off as far as possible. I think increasingly, though, as you were mentioning, both retail customers, but also big institutional clients are looking for something else. I think that pressure will grow, but I think the speed at which the transition needs to occur means that government's going to have to step in and make sure that transition, especially around the transparency around the risk to the banks themselves and to their client base, is being properly disclosed. So I think you'll see a lot more in that direction, both regulatorily, but also from those activist shareholders you're mentioning.
Okay, the third prediction of yours is that Canada will proceed with a just transition and to ensure preparedness for a zero carbon future. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is something that's really critical, I think, to get right. Canada has a crappy history on these kind of issues. We're kind of known for denying that we have some kind of collapse impending in a particular resource area right up until literally the hour before it finally collapses. And then we can, tell people, go learn Microsoft Word and collect UI or EI for 6 months, and then you're on your own. I think, to bring people along with the energy transition, we're going to need to do better than we did for cod and trees. We need to do something better here so that people can actually plan their future. And I think it's really important, both for the individuals involved, so that people know that they have a viable economic future for themselves that are employed in these industries. But it's also incredibly important politically, to create the political buy-in for people not to resist the idea that we need to end fossil fuel extraction. So I think there's a lot more of a conversation about this than there was any time in the past around other resource issues that I've been involved in. And that gives me some hope that government is more serious about it this time.
Now, we saw last October, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland went to Edmonton, and she gave a speech in which she talked about real muscular industrial policy, quote unquote. And your blog post mentions industrial policy. And full disclosure for viewers, I was hired as a contract writer to help to lead the team that wrote the Alberta Federation of Labor's recent economic policy strategy report, which used industrial policy quite heavily. But it seems to me that if we're going to move things along, that modern industrial policy has to be at the core of the federal government's planning or of its economic policy. And I don't see that. And I certainly don't see it at the provincial level. What are your thoughts?
Well, they've been talking about this. And as you mentioned, the finance minister, has given a couple of good speeches about this. And I think the proof still is in the pudding about whether or not that's actually going to emerge out of some of these conversations that the federal government is having with the provinces. But clearly it's needed. It's the backbone of any kind of just transition, is to have a new place for people to be going, new places for investment to flow, new places for workers, and to have that be in sectors that are part of the clean energy future. So it's something that's a priority for us. I know that a bunch of the organizations that we work with, whether that be labor or industry, shares that view. And I think that there's going to be a growing push to prioritize some of the key industries that can be winners in this new space on a regional basis, and put the mechanisms, regulations, policies in place that are going to allow them to succeed.
Right, fair enough. One of the things about industrial policy is there's a big focus on, first of all, strategy. So you come up with a strategy to build an industrial cluster. And this becomes really important because, and I'll be arguing this, viewers and listeners, in 2023 in some columns and essays that I've got planned. But the 2022 seems to have been the year that the combination of the accelerating energy transition, the economic shock that was created with the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the energy shock that was felt when Russia invaded Ukraine in February of last year, all of those combined triggered essentially what an economic transformation. Europe, in particular the United States with the US Inflation Reduction Act, have decided that they now need, it's full steam ahead to build the industry that supports clean energy. We're talking EV plants, battery plants, wind turbine plants, solar panel plants, on and on and on. And this seems to be the focus for at least for the rest of this decade, is to get in, build in these industrial clusters, the supply chains that they require, so that North America can compete with Europe. North America can compete with Asia Pacific. And it seems like Canada, the Americans, now that they've got wrapped their head around it, are going gangbusters. We're not. We're still doing a lot of talking and a lot of hand wringing and trying to figure out what this is all about. Would you agree or disagree?
I agree, and I think that's caught Canadian governments off guard. An example here in Ontario, the Ontario government was elected in 2018, and one of their kind of slogans was like, kill the electric vehicle, right? We hate it. They took the charging stations for electric vehicles out of the GO stations and got rid of all of the incentives and infrastructure and stuff, and but pretty soon came around to the idea, that means we don't get to have a car industry in Ontario anymore then. Maybe we have to stop hating electric vehicles. Maybe that's not going to be a good thing for us or for our future electromobility. So I think they've been kind of dragged into this kicking and screaming in a lot of cases, and in other cases where they're not so oppositional to the idea, like at the federal government level, I don't really think that there's been enough attention put into doing the things we were talking about before, which is what are appropriate strategies for different provinces, and what is the role of various levels of government to make this happen. To enable investment, to prove out the resource, for example, so that someone else who has private capital can bring that to bear and produce new product or new energy sources and bring them to market. I think that Canada has been behind, and I think taken by surprise by the U.S. Like given how split their or how much turmoil their government's been, I don't think really anyone was expecting that Joe Biden and the Democrats were going to be able to land anything. And then suddenly it's here, and as you're saying, it's going like gangbusters, and we're kind of being left behind, and that obviously is dangerous for us.
Right. That's another conversation that we have to have at the national level, because if governments were caught by surprise, I think Canadians still don't even understand. We're not even having the conversation. I think the general public doesn't understand what's at stake and is not involved in this conversation in a big way at all. It's not on the list of priority. You see, polling, for instance, what are your top, 5 or 10 issues? And this isn't even on the list. So we've got a long way to go on this, but I don't want to beat this horse too badly. So let's move on to number 4. And speaking of Ontario, your fourth prediction is that Ontario will realize the mistake of paving over the green belt and critical ecosystems. I hope that's true. I'm not sure that Doug Ford is the man to have a road to Damascus experience on this issue.
We'll see. He's had a couple before. The first try they had at the Greenbelt with legislation, they ended up backing down on it. They didn't this time. They backed it down on the labor legislation, the use of the notwithstanding clause. They passed a bill, and then a week later, once it became clear that the whole province was going to shut down, they decided it was maybe not such a great idea. So it is possible. I think that the scale of the revulsion to what they've done here is so widespread, so deep, and so across voting intention that's going to become very, very clear to them. And the fact that the resistance isn't going to go away and is going to build, I think will really lead to a conversation within the government caucus about revisiting some of these decisions.
Well, let's hope that your optimism bears out in 2023. Now, I want to get on to number 5, because this is one that again, in North America, we're not picking up on this. In Canada, we're not picking up on it. And that's that the conflict in Europe with Russia invading Ukraine has really sped up the green transition. And the response in Canada from the oil and gas industry has been, these frantic demands to approve new infrastructure, expand production in LNG and oil exports, instead of understanding that, in May, the European Commission passed the Repower EU is the name of the strategy. And the idea is to accelerate the electrification of Europe, and also, of course, the acceleration of producing low carbon fuels like hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuel. So the increase in demand for non-Russian supplies of oil and gas, it may be strong for 5 years, but it is not going to be strong past, say, 2030. And I don't think we've quite realized that fact yet.
I don't think so at all. In fact, the media was dominated, as you've mentioned, by oil and gas industry trying to take advantage of the very real energy crisis that was pending in Europe as a result of the Russian invasion, to try and use that as an argument why we should increase export of fossil fuels. But of course, it's just kind of silly. I mean, the whole idea that you're going to deliver natural gas pipelines across the country, build terminals, and send them to Europe in an emergency, it's just not possible, right? Physically not possible to do that. And in the very short to medium term, the gearing up of the energy transition that's now underway in Europe as a response to this, to get off the dependence on Russian fossil fuels is huge. I just read a really interesting stat the other day. By 2024, Germany, just Germany alone, is going to be installing 500,000 air source heat pumps a year. So, if you look at, we're about 47% of the German population. So if we were doing the same kind of percentage amount, that would be 250,000 air source heat pumps a year going in across Canada. I don't know what we're at, but I bet it's like 2,500. So, like,
No,
we
I
are
actually
so
have
far
that.
behind.
Tim, I actually have that number. The interview that I did earlier today, it's 20,000 a year. And the calculation of Brian Livingston, the author of the study, was that to meet Canada's emissions targets for buildings, we would have to do between now and 2030, 600,000 heat pumps per year.
Right, that sounds about right, because we've been so far behind. And so we're about an order of magnitude behind where just Germany alone is planning to go on this issue. So, and then there's all the other initiatives that you mentioned. So Germany really is pivoting. Europe more broadly is pivoting. And I think that, we really are dreaming if we are going to look to produce more fossil fuels to fill a declining demand.
Well, let's talk about prediction number 6. Canada will proceed with a full environmental assessment of proposed Highway 413. Maybe you could give us a little bit of background for our non-Ontario viewers and listeners on the project and what Canada plans to do.
Yeah, this is a highway that goes north of the GTA, Greater Toronto area, and starts over in Milton, arcs around Brampton, and goes over, meets the 400. It's about 60 kilometers long. New mega 400 series highway, goes through the Greenbelt farmland. And it really is a signature example of what's wrong with planning in Southern Ontario under the current government. Sprawl on highways instead of compact, sustainable development. In fact, the city of Brampton, for that same place where the highway would be built, has a competing proposal of an urban boulevard with transit ways, buildings with retail at grade, apartments and condos above it, street cafes, etc. So an urban space. And instead, the province is saying, nope, we're going to build you a 1950s 4-lane highway in the middle of a cornfield and surrounded by big box stores and sprawl. So it has been designated for an individual impact assessment by the federal government. We're still waiting for the province, almost 2 years later, to submit their project proposal because it's so deficient in so many areas of federal jurisdiction. I think it's going to go to a full panel review, and that'll really allow a broader conversation, not just for Ontario, but for the country as a whole, about why in 2023 now, the idea of building new superhighways instead of public transit and denser, smarter cities is insane. And it's going to be a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that because my take on this is that while in the short term, we may see an increase, or we won't see a decrease in the number of vehicles as we switch from internal combustion engine to electric, there's enough technology coming down the road. And I'm thinking like autonomous robo-taxis and other kinds of public transit like shuttles and so on, that we can actually make the transportation system work far more efficiently, move more people with fewer vehicles, and so that we don't need this continued construction of highways. And the technology may not be there, today to do that, but it will certainly, by the time this Highway 413 might be built, would be there. And so we need to be looking ahead rather than always looking behind us for our models around these kind of projects.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking at least 10 years before the shovels would be in the ground in this project. It's about 10 billion if it went ahead. 85 stream crossings, like you name it, it's a bad idea. And if any of the things that you're talking about in terms of application of AI to transportation and the move from cars to be something that's individually owned by people to something that's collective, you're kind of running around the landscape, picking people up in groups or individually, the number of vehicles on the road and the level of congestion could dramatically drop. And what do you need all these huge highways for if you cut the number of vehicles in half? So it's really high risk, high cost, and very, very destructive.
I'd agree. And just to tie a bow around this part of our conversation, Tim, the important thing is that some of this you can strategize around. Now is the time. We talked about industrial strategy. Well, now is the time, where we should be sitting down as a country and as individual provinces and regions to have these kinds of what's coming and how might that influence the projects that we're contemplating to improve transportation and so on. And we just aren't having the conversation. And this not having the conversation seems to be I don't know if it's a uniquely Canadian thing, but goodness gracious, I can think of a dozen sectors like electricity where we need to have a conversation and we're not at all. So maybe the environmental assessment process on this project will open up some of that conversation in Southern Ontario. Well, let's go on to the prediction number 7. The federal clean electricity standard will force Ontario to stop building more gas plants. And this is, it's nuts. Anybody increasing natural gas power generation at a time when wind and solar are probably half of the levelized cost of energy of gas doesn't strike me as being smart environmentally or economically.
No, it makes very little sense. We had really great uptake on wind and solar, and of course, Alberta has had some fantastic results with their open electricity market, doing auctions and getting wind prices that are just amazing. We could be doing the same thing here. We have massive amounts of rooftop space throughout all of the cities of Southern Ontario for solar, help reduce either companies or individuals' electricity costs. We really should be thinking about investing in a smarter grid. We've got electric vehicles coming on for storage opportunities, especially in densely populated places like Southern Ontario. There's lots of things we could be doing other than locking in gas plants. I mean, the level of ideological commitment to burning fossil fuels from this government is truly astounding. I mean, they're actually right now contemplating that if the federal emission standards cause those plants to be shut down by 2035, that they will lock into contracts for Ontario ratepayers to continue to pay those gas plants as if they were still producing electricity, even if they're not operating. So it's just really a massive abdication of responsibility to the public, both on the pollution side, but also on the financial accountability and cost side. We could have renewable energy much cheaper than we can get this gas stuff.
I interviewed Professor Mark Winfield of York University a lot on this particular issue. And a point that he makes over and over again is in Ontario, there's no energy planning. That it just is not within the government. There's no regulator. The Ford government disbanded the regulator back, I think it was 2019. And there's no place to have these kinds of conversations and to do strategy and forward-looking planning around energy. And the consequence of that is that Ontario, Canada's largest province and its industrial heartland, there's a very real existential threat here as the world begins to do this industrial transformation that I've been talking about. And Ontario just doesn't seem, it's a freight train coming, and Ontario is either ignoring it or thinks it's something else.
Yeah, I mean, the only kind of planning that they're doing is recognizing that there's going to be an increase in the need for electricity because of the move to things like air source heat pumps and EVs and other things we're talking about. But instead of thinking, okay, well, how does this create a huge opportunity for the industrial heartland of Ontario? And how could we be producing, a smart grid, smart appliances? How could we bring on renewable energy? No, we're just going to ramp up a whole bunch of gas plants and hand out massive subsidies for new nuclear capacity, which we know is super expensive. And because once you start building one, once you have cost overruns or once it's operating and those pressure tubes, they find, you x-ray them and find them, they've got a couple of cracks in them, you're not going to not maintain them. So we're then all on the hook again as the public to fork out the money to keep these things safe. So it's not smart. It's ideologically driven in my mind, and really is something that needs to change. And I think the federal government really needs to be on top of this with their clean electricity standard and not allow the province to get away with what they're planning on gas.
Well, let's move on to prediction number 8. Indigenous groups will stand up against toxic tailings, and I assume that's the oil sands, and the Line 5 pipeline. What were you thinking of with this prediction?
Yeah, it's been interesting over the last year or so, just the resurgence in Indigenous opposition to the plans the federal government were floating about dumping tailings into the Athabasca River. I really think that these have been long-standing concerns around health impacts, wildlife impacts, etc., for the folks who live downstream directly, but also the broader Indigenous community, both on the Athabasca and Alberta, but all the way downstream into the Northwest Territories, etc. So I think that the organization around that is really growing, and the demand there is going to be for something to be done that actually cleans them up, rather than the idea that somehow we can just skim off the water and dump it into the Athabasca River. So that's one, and then the other, of course, is in growing Indigenous opposition to the idea that we should be putting oil pipelines on the bottom of the Straits of Mackinac. With the possibility of catastrophic rupture and the damage to the Great Lakes, but also more directly within Indigenous communities along the lines themselves on land. Just a rejection of the idea that we should be building in this day and age more dangerous fossil fuel pipelines, which have a propensity to leak and cause all kinds of mayhem.
Well, let's talk about prediction number 9, because this one is of great interest to me, and that is that Canada will eliminate subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. And I know that the government has said that they will do that. The problem is that the Oil Sands Pathways Alliance is asking the various levels of government, but primarily Canada, for $50 billion to build carbon capture, utilization, and storage to decarbonize the oil sands. Never mind conventional production, never mind, that's 60% of Canada's oil production. But then there's another 40% that would have to be decarbonized, and presumably federal money spent on that. Well, if you're giving money to oil companies to build infrastructure, that's a subsidy. And how they square eliminating public subsidies for oil and gas while they're giving them subsidies to decarbonize oil and gas, I can't square that circle.
Yeah, me neither. I mean, I think, it's one of the things that I think you're starting to see some of the tension emerge around this. I think the whole Pathways Alliance was a pivot away from the approach that had been taken by CAP for years, which was very, very adversarial with the federal government. So instead, they've come up with this kind of, oh, yes, we'd love to help you meet your net zero commitments, but it's going to take you paying for it, public, because we couldn't possibly afford to do it ourselves. But I think the federal government and the public more generally are kind of wise to this, and I think the direct cash handouts for this stuff are going to be very, very hard to secure, as they should be. If the oil sands industry wants to survive in a world of declining demand when they're a high cost producer, but they're making lots of money currently, then they're going to have to pay for this stuff, because we really need to be spending the money on the energy transition, not propping up something that absolutely has to go away over time. So I just don't think you're going to see more of that, the cash. The tax treatment, the tax subsidies that they're getting right now, those are a real problem and something we're going to continue to work on. But it is a commitment that government has made, to the rest of the world to address these subsidies. We were really happy to see them end the spending of Export Development Canada money on fossil fuels outside of the country. The speed at which that happened, even though we've been pushing for it a long time, like it was done and it was, it was over, that was really encouraging. And we're hoping to see a similar level of action on commitments that are being made domestically.
Well, I know you're involved in this issue, so I'm going to float a hypothesis here. It's that the federal government will not end its subsidies to the oil sands for the Pathways Alliance CCUS project. And the reason is because the Prime Minister and the government have painted themselves into a corner. The Prime Minister announced at COP26, so just over 14 months ago, that there would be an immediate quote unquote cap on oil and gas emissions. That hasn't happened yet, but there's a lot of expectation now that it will. And the industry isn't willing. This is a very complex technical issue. It requires a lot of capital to do it, and the industry doesn't want to pay for it. And I think the political pressure on the federal government is going to be so great that in order to relieve it, they're simply going to throw buckets of cash at the oil and gas industry to make this problem go away. Why do I think that? Because they've done it many times in the past with different industries, including oil and gas.
I hope you're wrong. And I think what's different now is that this clearly is an industry that is going to have to get smaller on a global scale. And that no matter how you cut it, the oil sands are, high cost, high emission industry. And I'm hoping that people within the federal government recognize that the billions that, was it the 50 billion you were saying, that the industry wants, that if we spent that on industries that actually could be employing more people in the future, producing cleaner energy, be part of an industrial strategy that we were talking about earlier for Canada, that would be a much, much better use of public money, in particular for the people of Alberta who are much more dependent on the oil industry than people in the other parts of the country. Because a future with a declining oil industry is going to be hardest on those areas, and something else needs to be built. So I'm really hopeful that they're not going to be bamboozled into handing out our cash when the oil industry itself should spend it if it wants to survive.
Well, I'm afraid I'm still not very, very optimistic, and we will see what happens. This is an issue that Energy Media will be reporting about extensively in 2023. So, folks, you can watch our interviews and my columns for more information as we go along. So, let's talk about prediction number 10. Canada will expand its ban on harmful single-use plastics, beginning to invest in reuse services and systems. So we live on Vancouver Island in a city of about 10 or 15,000. There's a catchment area about 50,000. And this is a big issue here. Yes, they collect the recycling, but it has to go someplace else to be recycled. And it's very inefficient, and there's no capital available to create a better system. And I assume that this applies all over Canada.
It's true. I mean, only about 9% of our plastics actually get recycled. The rest of them end up in the environment in some way. They're landfill or being burned or ending up in Southeast Asia and then in the ocean. So it's a really huge problem. It's also a domestic problem in terms of pollution. And there's huge opportunities here, I think, both politically and environmentally and economically. The more that you circularize the economy, have things that are produced, used, collected, washed, reused, the more people it takes to do that, the more equipment it takes to do that, the more money that stays within the economy when that happens. So I think as well that it's a political opportunity because the public is broadly on side with less plastics. We're buried in the stuff. We know the industry has a plan for massively increasing the amount of plastics that it produces as a way to compensate for declining demand for fossil fuels from transportation fuels going down. We don't all want to be buried in it. We can't have our planet buried in it. So some of them that can't be recycled at all need to be banned. And then what I think is really taking off now is conversations among companies about reusability. And many of the things that we use every day, many of the packages really could be something that were being returned to a depot. They were all similar in shape and design. The branding for a particular company could just be a paper sticker on it that could be washed off each time. But the packaging themselves would not be single use and then into the landfill. And there's a lot of entrepreneurship in this space that's really fascinating. And I think what you'll see is more government involvement, more government leadership, especially at the federal level where there's a lot of interest. But some of the provinces are better on these issues. Ontario's terrible, but Alberta's not been bad and BC's been pretty good. So I think that you'll see some cooperation there too.
Well, let's get on to prediction number 11, that there will be a cap on oil and gas carbon emissions, the one I referred to, the COP26 promise from the Prime Minister. I think there will be a cap, but I don't think that it will be what's required, and it won't be what the prime minister promised. The oil and gas industry has a massive lobbying presence in Ottawa, and it's been pulling out all the stops to do this. The oil sands, for example, has said if they don't start building carbon capture, utilization, and storage infrastructure almost immediately, they won't have it in place in time to meet 2030 targets, and they won't be able to meet any interim targets either, because the prime minister has promised annual targets, annual reductions. This seems the emissions, oil and gas carbon emissions cap seems to me to be, frankly, a mess.
Mm. You know, it's something that we need because nothing else has really worked. The exposure to the carbon price that the industry experiences is so low that it just doesn't change the behavior around emissions. So, you know, using the market mechanism, which, you know, a lot of people involved in carbon reduction, you know, are diehards for, you know, using carbon pricing. Problem is that we end up designing the systems in such a way that the actual exposure is so low that nobody is incentivized to change their behavior. So that's where the cap comes in. And it'll be a real test to see whether the federal government is serious about driving down emissions in that sector. And it also, of course, ties into the company's willingness to invest in that technology that they say is so great and that is so available and so workable. To actually do it, which of course then ties into them demanding that they don't really believe it's that great, and if we want it, then we should pay for it as the public. So it's all tied together, and it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. But if it's going to work, the caps need to be real. They need to be declining over time, and the industry itself needs to invest in the technology to get there, and not us paying for it.
A little bit of context here. Just last month, the federal government and the Alberta government came to an agreement on toughening up the industrial emitters carbon tax. It's called TIER in Alberta. The problem, of course, and you alluded to it, is they get a discount, and it's called output-based pricing system. And basically, it gives the oil and gas industry and other industries, but in oil and gas, the discount's about 80 to 90%. So even if you toughen up on one side, the discount dilutes that market signal to the companies on the other side, and you really haven't done much. All you've done is, you know, you've made the appearance of being tough on emissions, and the practical effect is nothing. So the fact that they've already in late 2022 come to an agreement, concluded negotiations with the Alberta government, it means it's very unlikely that in the next year or two or three, they'll reopen negotiations to make it tougher yet. So I have absolutely no faith that the carbon tax will be the vehicle by which they use to put the cap on oil and gas emissions, which only leaves, because we remember that last February, they brought out a discussion paper on the oil and gas emissions cap, which only provided two options. One is cap and trade, and the other was increasing the carbon tax. So now that leaves us with cap and trade. And my understanding of the discussions is we're nowhere on that. We're no further advanced than we were a year ago when the discussion paper came out. So you can understand, while we need it, we all recognize it, that it's, I'm sorry to be cynical, but the government's record on this file is not very positive.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a history of commitments around mechanisms to reduce emissions that involve the oil sector, and then, you know, the oil sector launching a full court press on the lobbying side and just, you know, running these things into the ground. So they never deliver very much. They're very good at that. I've been involved in some of the conversations over the years, and, you know, their capacity to hire very smart people to deliver pressure unendingly is very good. So that's kind of where it might get to. But I agree with you that if we're going to have a system for emissions cap that works, that cap and trade is the one that we're going to need. It's really the only kind of mechanism around carbon pricing that actually guarantees you that you will achieve your emission reductions. Because you're issuing permits and you just pull them from the market, and the emissions go down because the permits aren't available, or the price escalates to such a level that it makes it worthwhile to reduce emissions.
And I'd like to point out here that if there was ever a time for the oil and gas industry to invest its own capital in emissions reduction, the rest of this decade is it. And I point over and over again to a Wood Mackenzie study that came out in 2021, I think, that said, look, chronic underinvestment in exploration and production since 2015, 2016 has led to supply shortages globally. That's going to elevate prices probably in the $80 to $100 a barrel range. And that means that oil and gas companies are going to be incredibly profitable for at least till 2030. Now, Wood Mackenzie argues that oil and gas companies should use that windfall cash to invest in low carbon businesses and strengthen their balance sheets so that they can pivot to the energy transition and declining demand, which also means lowering emissions. So what are the Canadian oil and gas companies doing? Well, of course, they're giving back all of that windfall profit in the form of higher dividends and share buybacks. So this very unique time in history where we actually have an industry that needs to decarbonize and can afford to pay the bulk, if not all, of its own decarbonization, and we're letting them off the hook. And I absolutely believe that we will let them off the hook again in the 2020s because that's been our history. And I don't see the political will from the Prime Minister, from the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, anywhere in cabinet to stand up to the industry and make them do what they need to do.
Yeah, I mean, I hope you're wrong. I mean, I think industry is doing the share buybacks and the dividend increases because they don't actually believe in their own future. And they want to take these high oil prices, the profits from those, and take that cash and essentially run, because they know that every time the price of oil is higher in today's world, today's technological world, that leads to more demand destruction. Right? The higher the price gets, people can go somewhere else. This isn't 1973 with the oil crisis, where people had nothing else to put in their vehicles or their homes. We now, every time the prices go up or there's a crisis, like we talked about in Europe, something else can fill that niche and it can be invested in and it can be scaled up. And that's a massive risk to the oil and gas industry over time. They know it. And I think they're planning to take as much cash from the system as they can. And if they can get governments to be stupid enough to give them like $50 billion to put in a bunch of machines that aren't going to work to try and store carbon in a way that is kind of useless, then that's great. Why not? Why not take the cash? It's not yours. And you can give all of your profits back to your shareholders. So it's a bad deal for us. And I think that they're just acting as rational actors in a market that's rapidly changing and taking the profits out from the investments that they've made. And if we're stupid enough to spend our cash on it, then they'll take it.
Well, fair enough. And I suspect we are that stupid.
History
would suggest we're that stupid.
I agree that history would suggest it. Let's hope we can learn from our mistakes.
Oh goodness, if only that were the case. Well, let's wrap this up with prediction number 12, that Canada will finally get its new toxics and environmental justice laws. Now, Tim, I confess that this is not an issue that I've reported on. I'm not familiar with it. Why don't you give us a little background and explain your prediction?
Sure. So the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is our kind of signature piece of federal legislation that crosses over many areas of federal responsibility around protecting the environment. It's about 20 years since the last time it was updated. And in particular, the aspects around the regulation and control of toxic chemicals really need to be addressed. And that is, there's been so much change, so much new information from the science community around how some of these toxic chemicals impact our bodies. The traditional view of, well, it's a bad chemical, but if you don't take too much of it, you should be okay. That's kind of what we thought 25 years ago. But now we have things like, BPA and these other hormone mimics, which even in microscopic quantities tell our bodies to do things because they're hormone mimics. They're mimicking the natural chemicals in our body, and they're very dangerous, even if they're present at all, just because of their nature. So there's a bunch of things like that need to be addressed. And the encouraging thing in this is that we do have a bill. We have a pretty good bill that's going through. It started in the Senate, which I didn't even know was possible, actually, but it started in the Senate last year, passed through the Senate. Now it's in the House. Of course, the House is recessed for the holidays. It's coming back. So I really do expect that it's going to see some improvements, and then we're going to have new, more up-to-date legislation. So that's great. And then the parallel bill is to address environmental justice issues. So we know that there are many communities, many of them indigenous, where we thought, oh, well, there's a poor community. Let's build some kind of toxic waste dump near them. And we have to clean these sites up. We have to have strategies around how to make sure that this doesn't happen again in the future, and to address some of the needs of the communities that are impacted. So this is going through the House as well. And I really expect that to see that come forward and get passed in the new year. So both of them are really important, and I think that we can see some real possibility for success there pretty early on in 2023.
Well, Tim, thank you very much for this. I really appreciate, we've covered a lot of ground here. And if I could sum this up, I often hear from the oil and gas folks that the energy transition is going to be bumpy instead of smooth. There has never been a smooth energy transition in the history of energy transitions. They're always bumpy. That's just the nature of change. And here, what we're doing, the global energy system is massive. Oil alone, that we consume 100 million barrels a day, and never mind, then there's natural gas and electricity on top of that, and on and on and on. Changing that system is not going to be easy. I expect that at the global level, it's going to go in fits and starts. We're going to have crises on a regular basis. It's going to take us a while to get this right and to switch over to clean energy. Mm-hmm. What I worry about in Canada is it'll be bumpier here than it needs to be. It'll be bumpier here than it will be in other countries because we're just unprepared. The conversations that are taking place about this transition, about the economic transformation, it's a very small group, and it meets behind closed doors. And it doesn't happen at a public level. We're not creating the political space with that conversation that is required to put in place the policy at the federal level and the provincial level to do what needs to be done. Your take on that?
I totally agree. I think we end up having political fights led by various political parties that are kind of surrogates for this, rather than like bringing folks into the real conversations that are necessary to make sure that this transition actually benefits Canadians and protects their long-term interests. We have a huge risk of being left behind, right? The energy transition, if we're going to survive as a civilization at a global scale, is going to occur, and it's going to have to occur very quickly because we're behind the 8 ball on this issue. My real concern for Canada is that the rest of the world is just going to be smarter in this space than we are. And then we're going to left behind still arguing about whether or not we should be increasing fossil fuel outputs, while the rest of the world is busy making air source heat pumps, installing renewable energy and smart grids, and driving electric vehicles. While we jump up and down and talk about like having the freedom to buy a gigantic gas guzzling SUV and keep pumping more oil with public subsidies. Like it's a stupid conversation to be having at a time when the rest of the world, whether it's democracies or dictatorships, are mostly headed in the opposite direction if they have any options at their disposal at all. And Canada has huge options. Big, rich country, lowly populated, huge amounts of resources. We're not Saudi Arabia where the only thing we produce is oil. There's lots of other stuff we can do here, but we pretend as if, sometimes I feel like we pretend as though, fossil fuels are like 80% of our economy when they're instead 10. And we really need to get over that and have an adult conversation, engage everyone in talking about the future we need to create.
Well, if there is a 13th prediction, Tim, that would be it, I think, is that we have the adult conversation that we have avoided, and that we ask our federal and provincial politicians and the governments to engage in that adult conversation. I'm not optimistic, but hopefully, we know what we need. Hopefully we'll make some progress on that in 2023. Thank you very much for this, and a happy new year to you and your organization.
Thanks so much. Happy New Year to you as well.